All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Hess III here with Hess 3 Consulting, and today we are here to discuss strategies for effective strategic planning. If this is your first time doing a webinar with me, welcome. It's a pleasure to virtually meet you. I do have about 15 years of experience working in health and human services, 10 of which have focused almost exclusively or in large parts on prevention efforts. Some of those have been through coalitions under the Strategic Prevention Framework. Some of that's been more at state level and at the federal level. Lots of different experiences and different worlds I've lived in, so to speak, that hopefully we'll be able to draw from and incorporate into today's session. Here's just a little bit about the company. I won't bore you with this info today, but definitely please feel free to check out our website if there's anything we can help you out with. So what are we here today to do? And our learning objectives are really to start talking about strategic planning, what it is not, and hopefully that will be a dynamic discussion. I think most people have a certain level of knowledge around what strategic planning is, and then others this may be a new concept for. So we'll dive into a lot of detail when we start going and providing that in-depth overview of tools and techniques that may be used to optimize your strategic planning efforts. So definitely please feel free to stop me as we have questions or if anything comes up that I can help you with. Hopefully this will be interactive today. So I do want to contextualize this because the focus or the context in which we're talking about planning is under the Strategic Prevention Framework. And so as part of our series, you can see on the left-hand side, we are now on training number 3 of a multi-part series centered around the Strategic Prevention Framework and prevention efforts, specifically here in Arkansas. And so if you've missed any of the previous sessions, they are available on YouTube, and we'd happily send you some links so you can access them remotely or retrospectively. And then, of course, you can see that we have some upcoming sessions in the next couple of weeks that hopefully you'll be able to chime into. But the Strategic Prevention Framework, if you're not familiar, is a SAMHSA evidence-based process model that is used for community development. And part of it is community or participatory action research to an extent when we're starting with our needs assessment, going into capacity building. Today, we're going to be talking about planning. In subsequent sessions, we'll talk about implementation work, evaluation, and of course, with the focus on sustainability and cultural competence. And so we're going to kind of weave those different topics, specifically sustainability and cultural competence, into our planning discussion today, as it's kind of the core of all of the work that we do, and we weave it into just about everything that we do. So for those of you that have been professionals for any length of time, I'm sure that you have heard or have been exposed to strategic planning on some level. So there's lots of definitions that are floating around, and I just have selected 2, although there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of definitions. So 2 of the ones that I like to use or that I thought encapsulated the concepts well are an organization's process of defining its strategy or direction and making decisions on allocating its resources to pursue that strategy, which I don't know if any part of that stuck out to you, but the piece that I thought was really helpful is first that it's a process, and that's what we're going to talk about today is a lot of process pieces or different steps of that process. It's not a one-off activity or even a one-time thing, but it's an ongoing component. And the second piece that stood out to me is centered around allocating those resources. And so the idea here is that if something is important enough to land on our strategic plan, then it's got to be important enough to land in our budget. And for those of us that do a lot of volunteer-based work or in-kind efforts, then it has to be something that's important enough for us to allocate our time to, whether that be our volunteer time or however else we're kind of compensated for that time. So I thought that was really important. The second definition is strategic planning is an organizational management activity that's used to set priorities, focus energy and resources, again, strengthen operations, ensure that employees or volunteers and other stakeholders are working towards common goals, establish agreements around intended outcomes and results, and assess and adjust the organization's direction in response to a changing environment. And so what I liked about this definition is it really talks about a lot of different layers that really describe the components of the process, but specifically this last part, adjusting the organization's direction in response to a changing environment. As we go through this process, I'm a strong advocate that strategic planning should happen at least annually, no less than annually, and I'll even throw out some shorter timelines as we move forward. But that every year we revisit, not based off of what we did last year or what the last strategic plan did or said, but off of what the current needs of our communities are, or the current organizational landscape or context in which we're operating. So I wanted to throw out a quick question to folks and see how else you may describe strategic planning. If there are any key words that maybe were not in either of these definitions, examples or thoughts. I know that you'll, if you will, actually, please type in the chat box for me. So if you want to just type in some keywords, I think that will be helpful and fruitful for our discussion. So I'll give you a couple minutes, but I'll wait for at least one response. So sometimes it's a little slow to get folks to engage with me, but do it for me, please. What other keywords? There you go, Shannon. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a guide. Absolutely. And we see that in the second definition, really about getting other stakeholders and everyone are working towards common goals and establish agreement. And that is absolutely what we're talking about with strategic planning as a guide. So thank you. So I want to take a quick pause and almost a little bit of a derailment because one thing that is very critical when conducting strategic planning is really understanding the team or the organizational dynamics. So sometimes, I don't know how many of you may have participated or may currently be in like startups, so to speak, where maybe it's a newer organization or newer coalition which we're working in, or it's kind of an informal group and now we're working to formalize ourselves a little bit. But there's these really important kind of team development stages. And they really drive a lot of not only the actual activities of strategic planning, how individuals get along and how they interact and how their voice is shared or power is distributed within the group, but also the types of activities that an organization might be ready to take on. So if you're not familiar, hopefully you are, Tuckman's team development process. I remember the first time I heard this, I actually laughed out loud because I just thought it was really funny that it all rhymes. But he says, that there are a couple of stages in team development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and then adjourning. And you can see the descriptions here in each of these. And so it's very normal in the life cycle of an organization or a new team. Maybe there's been some significant leadership transition within an organization, and they may go back through some of these stages, even if some of the folks have been there 23 years or beyond, but there's new leadership or really loud, influential voices in the process, then the team has changed, and it's time to revisit some of these positions. And so it's one thing that I always try to take a pause to, and making sure that those team dynamics, before you try to get a group of people to go down this really structured and collaborative process, to really understand where they are or how they exist and interact as a team. So you can see the question on the left-hand side that I'm going to ask. Within your organization or within your coalition or your prevention efforts, where or which stage of this process do you see your current team at, and where are they performing? I'm going to expect everybody to type in an answer for me. And I see we got a good crowd today, so hopefully we'll get a lot of responses. So is your team forming? So it's really new and people are just getting used to each other, feeling each other out. Are we storming? Are leaders trying to emerge? Are people feeling like their voice may not be getting heard? Are we normalizing our behavior or kind of getting group norms and collective processes and some structure in place? Have we really hit that kind of pivotal point of performance? Or is it, are we sunsetting the organization? Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, well, it sounds like a lot of our groups are performing really well. That's wonderful. So given the groups that are, in their forming stage, I'll try to remember this as we go through the training a little bit more. As we're designing different activities and strategies, we may want to keep this in mind. And for folks that are in the performing stage, hopefully some of this synthesis and clearly defined roles and kind of expectations and stuff, all of that will be in place, and that might make this easier. But especially those groups that are in that forming and storming phase, strategic planning may be very challenging because there may be a lack of trust, there may be a lack of familiarity, there's not as much organizational strategy or structure, I should say, to really help guide these things. And so we'll continue to recircle back to this because it's going to be really critical. So I didn't want to be too simple or simplistic, but I definitely wanted to make sure that we covered some somewhat obvious, maybe, types of things, as well as get into some more kind of advanced tools and strategies. So forgive me if some of these, seem a little bit blatantly obvious, but for folks that maybe have not thought this through or have not done this before, so hopefully this might be new to some folks. So when you're preparing for strategic planning, so, it's a new year, or maybe you've just formed, or maybe the group has been kind of like waxing and waning for the last 6 months without a lot of clear direction, no matter how long they've been around. If there's really a lack of a cohesive, organized effort with resources allocated behind it, that's always kind of the trigger to know, hey, it might be time to do strategic planning. If you've sat through 5 meetings and been like, what was that about? What just happened? What is this group even doing? That's the time for strategic planning. And even if you do have a firm, strict plan in place, they should be time limited, which we'll talk about. So, again, hopefully, and as I'll advocate, no less than annually, you'll say it's time to revisit this. So in preparation for that, you want to think through, of course, who's going to be invited, if you're going to use a facilitator, or who is going to facilitate, whether it be external or internal to the group. Obviously, you want to invite these people, make sure they're available. We're going to dive into more detail about this, but talking about preparing a report or presentation of current status. So getting a really good understanding of where you're currently at, successes, challenges, external drivers, internal drivers. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a second. Spending some time to engage your decision makers and high influencers to identify their priorities. That's specifically in case they're not able to participate in the actual strategic planning session. And when we're talking about, a structured facilitated activity, if you have more than 10 people present, it's going to be incredibly challenging. Now, of course, there are a lot more than 10 people that are interested in your work, whether that be your funders, whether that be the volunteers, all of your coalition members, or your organizational staff. There's a lot of folks that may want to be present or maybe could be invited, but you want to be really thoughtful about who's actually going to be invited, because it is next to impossible to facilitate strategic planning with 25 people in a room. So you want to get their input through other ways, and we're going to talk through that. And then, of course, you want to coordinate logistics. And some people will do strategic planning over a 3-day weekend. Some people will do strategic planning, over half a day. I've done it in as little as an hour. It just depends. And so based off of those things, you want to make sure that the space is conducive. And especially when we start talking about the tools and techniques, you'll see why that's so important. The facilitator supplies, all of those types of things. If you're going to allow people to participate via phone, just little things. Again, I know that those are kind of obvious, but things to think about, especially if this is your first time that you'll be in charge of kind of setting this up. So who should be involved and to what extent? And so this is a very kind of Robert's 2 cents on the universe, subjective kind of list, but think through the different types of stakeholders that you have in your group. So of course you have your funders, your board of directors if you're an organization, or maybe that's like a leadership team within your coalition. If you have like an executive committee, those are kind of synonymous. You have your external stakeholders, so that could be the schools that you work with or churches that you work with, or any external party that's involved in your work, whether that be the mayor or a police officer or someone who has really been an advocate or an opponent of your efforts. Your internal leadership team. So again, if you are a formal organization, that might be your CEO or your program manager or coordinators, whatever that staff might be. Of course, your staff and volunteers. So again, depending on the size of your agency or your group, your customers or community members. And then, of course, you want to think about kind of what the experts have to say. And you can see their level of influence varies. And that's really the subjective part is, how heavily should you consider influence or input from these folks. The most important part is identifying who your decision makers are. Lots of people may want to have input in your process. But especially if you're in those forming and storming phases, it's important to define who actually gets to make decisions about this process, who gets to say when our strategic plan is done, who gets to say, we're going to go left or right, and whether that be, and we'll talk about decision making in a little minute. So if you see on the left, what additional parties do you have participate in your strategic planning session? So think through if I've missed anyone within your participant list. And I see while you're typing that, I'm going to answer this question in our chat box. So do you have any suggested maximum number of participants in a strategic planning meeting? Personally, Tara, if I'm saying your name correctly, I hope I am, I would say 10 is a maximum. But as we've just gone through this list, there's almost 10 different people on this, or types of people on this list. And so we'll talk through strategies on how to get other people's input. And I think I put that on this previous slide, and I'll just revisit it in case for whatever reason I did not write it in. So for the other people that are not going to be in the room, we really want to focus on these components. Prior to strategic planning, we want to spend some time maybe going and interviewing those folks, or maybe considering hosting a focus group, especially if, for example, you're doing like a youth outreach project and you're focusing on schools. Before you go into strategic planning, it might be really great to spend some time in a focus group with the middle schoolers and high schoolers or the students that you're interacting with. Those might not be people that have formal decision-making authority, and especially not budget decision-making authority on the activities that you're going to do over the next year. But because they are kind of the customers or the recipients of your programming, getting an insight into what they're interested in and what they think works and what they think doesn't work, or what their unmet needs are, is really important. So I think this concept of bringing in external input without people actually sitting in the room is really important. And we talked about up here, preparing this report or presentation of current status. This can come back from kind of those, I'm flipping back and forth quite a bit. But we talk about think tanks and experts. Before you go into strategic planning, there's always this preparation part, or at least I advocate that there's a preparation part where we, go back to some of the literature and say, what's come out in the last year is promising practices. And what are those think tanks and experts saying? What are our community members or customers? Again, maybe that's those adolescents or youth that are participating in the program. What are they saying that they need or want? Now, again, all those people aren't going to sit in the room, but you want to roll all of that content into kind of a presentation of sorts. Here we go. So here are some of the questions that you may want to roll into that. So what is the organization's business interest? What is considered valuable to the customer? So again, what are those youth interested in seeing? Looking at financial performance, did we have enough money to do all of our programming? Were we over budget, under budget? That's going to really inform some of our strategic decisions. What products or services should be included or excluded? So and we're probably going to think more about programs. So what programs should be included or excluded? In my 15 years of work in this field, there's definitely been organizations and programs that, they're kind of legacy programs. They've been around for a really long time, but the passion for them kind of died out a while ago. The purpose and mission behind them died out a while ago, but we continue them simply because it's what we've always done. So that's a hard conversation to have. Especially if that's someone's job, there's an employee in that position, but continuing to do stuff just because we've always done it doesn't really bring maximum output or outcomes, excuse me. And so having that conversation is important. Looking at the geographic scope, if maybe we're so successful in this county or in this one school district and it's time to grow into another school district or another county or 10, who knows? Of course, you're always going to look at your competitive advantage, your skills and resources, and you can see number 8 is highlighted or bolded because, again, it's really going back and reviewing those findings from what is the community telling us. It's not a full needs assessment. I'm definitely not advocating that folks go through that very rigorous process every year, but it is a conversation, and that can be informal, that can be formal. I've done that on the phone with folks right before strategic planning. I've done that, again, in meetings, maybe bringing at the most recent coalition meeting, asking them like, hey, I'm going to be meeting with the board next week to do strategic planning. What is it that you want them to know? Or what are your priorities? So then you're able, while those people may not be formal decision makers, they do still get a voice in the process. And all of that gets shared at the strategic planning session, kind of as that level setting step 1, before you kind of dive into the more rigorous activities, which we are about to dive into. Are there any questions before I move forward? Or actually, I want to pause. Let me pause and see. Is everyone okay? If you'll type a Y in the chat box if you're with me, or an N in the chat box if you're not with me. All right. It looks like we're good without any questions. Fantastic, guys. What other types of information do you think are helpful or might be helpful in kind of this preparation phase? This might be new. I've participated in a lot of strategic planning sessions, and not everyone does this kind of like report out or status report in advance. So this is definitely my 2 cents on the universe. But what else do you think would be helpful for those decision makers when doing strategic planning? Types of information or people to reach out to. I definitely want to get a couple of answers. Since I just saw you all type Ys, I know you're near your keyboards. I tricked you. So what other types of information might work or be helpful? Yeah, so of course, evidence-based data, that is critical. And sometimes it's not available, or sometimes, you can use a case study or something from another community, but absolutely, Tara, I think that is a great example of something that we can do. So we're going to start diving into different techniques, and there's quite a few of them, and I don't frankly know that I have enough time to get through all of them. So I might move pretty quickly through some and spend a little bit more time on others. The goal in this next section is really just to put some tools in your tool belt. You don't have to use all of these. You don't have to use any of them. And hopefully there's a few of them that will be a new spin on maybe something you are familiar with. But the goal is, just to kind of, again, expose you to a couple of tools that will help you as you're going through this. And these are ideally activities that a facilitator would do with your group at your strategic planning session. So again, when you have those 10 or so folks in the room, probably going to be mostly decision makers. You've already briefed them on all of the content from the community and the best practices, and you reported out financials for the last year and kind of where the whole layout of the program. Everyone's on the same page with where we're at, what are the latest trends in the field, needs, and everything. And so now we're going to kind of switch our brains and start thinking through, what are we going to do about it? So one of those steps is to get a better understanding of the environment. And so some folks are probably familiar with the PEST analysis, and there's an adaptation of that called the PESTILE analysis. But essentially, you look at the political, economic, social, technical, legal, and environmental drivers or contexts for your work. So you would go through line by line with a group, what are the political influencers or drivers? They can be positive, they can be negative, pros or cons, but let's have a conversation about what the political climate is potentially doing. And you may even want to, discuss potential risks or, potential changes in the pipeline, but it's just to, again, conceptualize, and you go through each one of these boxes. The PEST, so just the political, economic, social, and technical, is the most common version of this. Legal and environmental may not apply to your work. So of course you can adapt this as you feel necessary. The next one is scenario planning. And so this is really interesting. I think that this comes into play in a lot of different ways. So this was originally developed by the military, and this is how a lot of like military strategy has been designed. And it's also been called like a what if analysis, which sounds silly. Again, that's another thing I laughed at the first time I heard it, where you literally say, well, what if this happens? And then you tease out kind of a scenario and you build it around, or you build in kind of strategies on what you would do if you were awarded $100,000 or $1 million grant tomorrow. And hopefully, it's based in reality. So hopefully you have applied for that $100,000 or that $1 million grant. So definitely please keep that practical. But so you go through and you look at social, technical, economic, environmental, and political trends. So again, you can see STEEP is very similar to PEST or PESTILE, and you can decide which one's better for you. But you identify how these factors may play out in the future. So looking, in the next year, or if you want to do longer term, you're more than welcome to do that to 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I mean, it's really hard to plan out beyond 10 years, or really 5 years in reality, but some people like to do it. And so you use multiple iterations and you ask, well, what if this happens? So again, what if we do receive $100,000? Or what if we need to hire an executive director for our organization? We need to pay them a salary. And then you can kind of create a story tree of sorts of all of the things that come into play when that happens, or if that were to happen. And again, you want to be as pragmatic and realistic as possible. You don't want to, go off into la la land, talking about winning the lottery, unless you have recently won the lottery. And then the goal here is you prepare responses to each possible scenario. So if we decide that we need to hire an executive director, then we know we need to do X, Y, and Z to be able to financially sustain that, or whatever the context is. And you can go on and on and on with this. So of course, maybe be rational and limit it to a couple of scenarios or some key decisions around what would need to happen. But this can definitely be very fun, especially if you do have a very tangible and realistic opportunity that would pivotally change the work that you're doing. So again, additional funding, new staff coming on board, or whatever that might be. Another tool that we like to use is force field analysis. So this gets confused with a lot. There's also like a 6 forces analysis, and there's a couple of other iterations. Some of them are related, and actually some just sound similar and are completely unrelated. But so this is really helping you design, and we're going to talk about like a SWOT analysis in a minute, and you're probably very familiar with those, but help you really understand what are the driving forces of your work. And so we look at 2 kind of primary things: driving forces as well as restraining forces. And we want to look at all of these things in light of a potential change. So this might actually be very helpful in your needs assessment process, to look at, why isn't our intervention working? Or excuse me, what could we do, to really shift the focus of our community, or to help folks get engaged. If there's like a really critical stakeholder and you need to figure out a way to get them on your side, you can actually put yourself in their shoes and use the force field analysis to do that. So at the bottom you see a small list of different types of forces to consider. This could literally be anything. So you typically wouldn't start with a list and then try to fit it into your boxes, but you would kind of organically discuss and negotiate kind of how these things play out. And I mean, it is quite as simple as that 2 by 2 table. So you just start listing what are the driving forces of substance use among youth. And maybe, again, you would use that, for like a program development. But looking at your organization, what are the driving forces of our success, or the driving forces of why we've struggled to do X, Y, and Z. And then you can look at those restraining forces as well. So maybe that's something you're familiar with. Have you guys seen this before? Let me actually ask. Has anyone ever done force field analysis or seen it? Again, if you'll just type a Y in the chat box, or an N if you have not. Okay, good. So it looks like some of you guys have done it, but hopefully this is new. Good, 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 good. Again, you can use one of these, you can use all of them. It's just really designed to put some tools in your tool belt. And obviously we're going through these very, very quickly. But for the most part, I hope you're feeling that they seem relatively self-explanatory. It's just different ways to think about some of these processes. So I know that most of you are probably familiar with a SWOT analysis. It's very, 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 very common. There are lots of ways to do a SWOT analysis, and I have actually offered 2 different ways for your consideration. So, of course, the SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And there's some definitions up there. I've seen different definitions, and so some people look at opportunities differently, and some specifically opportunities and threats seem to have evolving definitions behind them. So the way that I've done this for many, many years, just because I find it to be the most simple, is this first box up here, where you literally just list it all out. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities? So kind of untapped resources is how I've always conceptualized opportunities, and threats, things external to us that could hurt us. I've always listed them out that way. And I've recently been challenged, and I think in a good way, to then shift that. So I still do step 1, where I put them all in these boxes and just kind of list things out. But then I take some time and I start to analyze the information, and I put them in the second table, where I identify what are the opportunities that exist that align with our strengths. And you can see that's the quick wins, money-making opportunities, or those are the big options that are really, really going to help us make some quick wins or low-hanging fruit for us. What opportunities exist out there but are really our weaknesses? So this is stuff that I need to start working on. Maybe we need to develop some new skills, or my coined phrase, you can recruit it or develop it. So do we need to recruit new skills and talent? Do we need to develop new programs? Do we need to do staff training? That type of stuff. What are the threats or the external things out in the environment that are our strengths? So this is a really silly example, but if you have a burglary problem and you also happen to have a really big dog, you might not be too worried about it. So, things that they're definitely things to be aware of, but you already have strengths in that position or in that area. So it's not something that you are super concerned about, or at least you have something to mitigate it in place already today. But the last area is probably the one that we all need to worry about. And that is, what are those threats that exist out there that are actually our weaknesses? And so this is we do not have anything in place. And so if, we were to be the victim of a cyber attack and we don't have any antivirus software, we're completely defenseless against whatever this might happen. I would imagine for some of us, this might be related to funding. If there was a threat of funding to be pulled, if we don't have super diverse funding and we're reliant on one single source, or maybe a very small amount of funding, then that would probably be a real weak spot for us. And so that is where we would then really want to spend a lot of time on our quick wins, maybe in this area where we need to develop some skills, but really on this area where we need to cover our tails to make sure that we are positioning ourselves for sustainability. So, like I said, I know that there's a lot of different ways that this gets operationalized. So I wanted to see if anyone else had done this differently. Are there other iterations of the SWOT or other ways that you have found this to be super helpful? And I'll give folks a second to type in the chat box for me. All right, I'm not seeing any responses. That's all right. I think this is a very commonly used tactic, and hopefully it's something that you guys are familiar and comfortable with using. I definitely recommend it. I use it for just about everything. So those tools that we just discussed are really to kind of help us kind of tease out kind of where we're at, where the organization exists, where the coalition exists, and really kind of help us get a good lay of the land. And those were just a few. There are all kinds of other ideas or other tools that we could use. There could be some root cause analysis into why certain things are happening. Of course, you can use like your deep dives and some of your like parking lot structures and different things to help capture like runoff ideas and things. And some of that might actually lend itself a little bit more into brainstorming. So once we have that firm understanding of kind of like what's going on in the world, where do we stand? Again, where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses that are also threats exist in those areas? Then it comes down to let's find some solutions for those problems or kind of where we want to go. So brainstorming is not revolutionary. Most of us probably learned about brainstorming when we were learning the writing process in the 3rd or 4th grade. I'm not sure when you actually learned that, but I remember I was really little. But there are lots of techniques that we can use that help folks to brainstorm better. And so, of course, the rules of brainstorming is we never judge. So we don't actually chew on an idea when it's presented. We really do want to go for quantity over quality. So throwing out as many ideas as possible. Of course, we want it to be focused. I'm reading off the left-hand side. So one conversation at a time. If possible, be visual. I know that sounds really obvious, but as a facilitator that has done this many, many times, I can't tell you how much confusion or contention comes when people don't feel like they're being heard or that their ideas aren't being captured correctly. Frankly, having a piece of flip chart paper and a whiteboard will save you so much time in the process, simply because you're able to write down in front of someone visually what they said and ask, if you wrote it down correctly. And that really helps validate people's thoughts. And of course, it then captures it for the notes and lots of other good things. But please be visual. It will save your life and save the process for sure. Of course, build on ideas, stay on topic, encourage wild ideas. And one of my other phrases I coin and throw out there quite a bit is that the answer is never no, but always how. And so in strategic planning or in brainstorming, it's not that we can't end all substance use in Arkansas by the end of the year. I know that sounds like a wild idea, but it probably is possible if we had unlimited resources and 100% authority to do what we needed to do. And so definitely allow yourself to go there and think, well, what would it actually take? Let's not shut down an idea simply because it sounds impossible or difficult. That's the whole point of brainstorming, is to get those wild ideas out there. So some strategies on how you can do brainstorming. One of my favorites actually is brain writing. So you just get people to write down their ideas on note cards or post-it notes or pieces of paper. If you are really artsy and creative, give people colored markers and pens and blank paper or paper with designs on it, and help them to do that. Fun fact about brainstorming is sugar stimulates creativity, so it definitely helps to get people up and moving around, get them to stretch. They've obviously been sitting down for quite some time after kind of doing introductions and listening to the lay of the land and then going through the SWOT analysis and all of that. So perfect time to take a break is right before brainstorming. Get the blood flowing, give them lots of sugar, not so much that they crash, but it will help stimulate their ideas. So they can write them on note cards. Figure storming is when you identify a person or a figure, and whether that be kind of like a guru or someone that you all admire, is if you are able to think about, what would that person do? So of course I picked Lorraine because she's amazing. And so, but you would ask, like, what would they do in this situation, or how would they address this problem? Mind mapping is wonderful for someone like myself who has a little too much ADD, because you're able to kind of see how ideas are connected and continue just to draw off of them. If you're not familiar with mind mapping, I highly recommend doing a quick YouTube search or figuring it out. So you essentially you draw a circle in the middle on whatever the topic is, and then you draw lines and stems off of that, of all of the things that are connected to it. And you can do, again, kind of a root cause analysis. So like, why is this happening? And you can just keep kind of building off branches and leaves, so to speak, off of that main idea. Or you could do, the what if scenarios, like, well, what if this happens and what happens next? You're able to kind of do like a linear thing. There's lots of opportunities. You can do relationship diagramming to see how things are connected. I personally, as you can probably tell, get very excited about it. Lots of fun. Rapid ideation is really just about, again, that quantity component. So you want to give people a time limit, and you want it to be a short time limit, 30 seconds, 10 seconds, 60 seconds, so that they don't have time to chew apart ideas or think critically or constructively criticize concepts. They just have time to like write it down. So people love challenges. It's great to split folks into teams and have them do that, set a 30-second timer or whatever, and say whoever gets the most ideas down on paper wins a candy bar or whatever you're going to do. Round robin, of course, you go around and every person has to contribute an idea. So even if it's a bad one, and again, you can turn that into a game, but it also gives you a good volume and also ensures that lots of different people are participating. Starbursting is fascinating because as opposed to creating an idea, you're creating questions. And so it provides the group with additional things to think about. And you can do starbursting round robin style. You can do it popcorn style where you just bounce around as people, call on each other. There's lots of different ideas, but it's often a good way to get the brain to start thinking differently. As opposed to coming up with answers, we come up with more questions, and then we can start answering those questions in the subsequent round or the next thing. Step laddering is very interesting. And this is predominantly used when you have a very vocal, influential person that can really kind of skew or could dominate the conversation. And so essentially what you do is you have everyone except two people leave the room, and those two people alone start generating ideas. And you can give them a time limit or say, come up with one or two ideas or whatever that might be. But you want to do this in a timely fashion, of course. Once they hit their 30-second timeline, or once they come up with their top 3 ideas, whatever that might be, then you add in one more person, and they come in and they join the discussion. So now there's 3 people discussing, and they're coming up with additional ideas. So now they have to come up with one more idea, or they have 30 more seconds to come up with ideas. And it's just, kind of incrementally in these small groups. And so then you keep doing this in iterations until the whole group is back together. And once everyone returns, then you now have this very robust list. But because of the way that it was created, you typically keep that loud person or highly influential person till the very end, so that everyone else of the group is able to participate and communicate before kind of that very influential dominant voice comes in and joins them. So it's just an interesting creative way to continue to do brainstorming. And there's dozens more of ideas. But again, I just wanted to kind of throw some different options at you. So what now? We have done our report out of the entire year. Everyone knows where the organization stands. We've done kind of our strategic analysis of the environment through our PEST and our SWOT and our STEEP and all that stuff. We understand what the environment is and what's out there. And then we've done all this brainstorming to generate solutions and ideas. So we have kind of current status. We have our competitive environment. We have these ideas on how to address all the problems. Now, how the heck do we land on a solution? And of course, there are lots of decision-making types. And this goes back to why it's so important that we focus on who is in the room, and that we identify, especially for groups that are kind of in those forming and storming phases, to identify who those decision makers are. because quite frankly, you might not make a decision in this one day. And everything that we've just discussed so far would take multiple hours to get through, even with a very skilled facilitator. And so, you want to be realistic around what you're going to accomplish in a particular day. But so lots of different ways to make decisions. And sometimes, it seems really difficult to build or get to a decision, which is why I kind of wanted to throw these ideas at you. So first, and the most common, is consensus. So everyone gets to vote, or we verbally agree, or we raise our hands, and everyone kind of, however you want to do that. People move or walk to different sides of the room for yay or nay, or if you're following Robert's rules, then it's simple majority rule by roll call, all the yays, all the nays, all the abstains. But there are other ways. So another technique is called the nominal technique. And so you identify, kind of your list of ideas, and everybody ranks the ideas. So if there are 5 ideas, you rank them 1 to 5. If there are 20 ideas, you rank them 1 to 20, however it is. And as each person ranks the ideas, the group discusses the winners. So you say, pick the top 5 strategies or the top 3 strategies, whatever that is. And you identify who those winners are. And you can stop right there. Frankly, that can be how you land on your final decisions. Or you can then build. Maybe ideas 3 and 4 are actually really similar, and we can reword them and move them together. Maybe, this 7 and 12 are identical, except one focuses on adults and one focuses on youth. So maybe those can be, combined or reworked, whatever. But you continually go through this process of ranking them and kind of editing, which allows everyone to have a voice in the process. The next one is similar, but there's a very specific nuanced difference, and that's the Delphi method. And I use this one all the time when I'm having a really dynamic group of people that just cannot seem to agree. So it is similar to the nominal technique, except that it's blinded. So everyone gets a piece of paper, and everyone votes silently. So you look at, again, we'll say with this top 10, and everyone has to pick what are their top 3. And so you write it down on a piece of paper. Nobody knows who voted for what. So it really takes away the power dynamic and the influence of some of those louder individuals, and really helps build actual consensus or an actual democratic process. So then you tally it up, and then you keep going until you get down to whatever your top 3 or 4. It's up to you to decide how many goals or activities you want to have throughout the year. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, and kind of some of those recommendations. But you essentially use this kind of blinded technique where people are voting on pieces of paper and no one knows who's voting for what, until you get down to the final list. And then you're able to use that final list by process of deduction. The dialectical inquiry technique is probably going to be better off in like a performing stage group, where people may have strong opinions, but there's also a lot of mutual respect, because you're literally going to have folks debate it. And so, if you're in kind of the early stages, or especially the storming stages when folks are not trusting each other, having them debate one another may only cause additional division in the group. So that's something to consider. And then another strategy is the devil's advocate. And you see this a lot, like actually in debates, where one person will intentionally pick kind of the opposite case or the opposite scenario, to make sure that the team is kind of discussing or thinking through all of the other reasons why we should pick a particular decision or a particular option over another one. And then you'll see on the right just some of the other kind of less involved, or maybe frankly more common decision-making techniques. So authoritarian. So again, if you have a single CEO who, the buck stops there and they get to make the final choice, or a single person that gets to make that decision, then that's fine. Delegated decision-making. So if one person is in charge of marketing and they get to decide, what the marketing project is going to do. This actually does work quite well with coalitions, because the power gets shared and people get to volunteer or voluntarily join different subcommittees and groups, and so allowing them to make decisions about what their group is going to be doing works really well. And then you can literally just eeny, meeny, miny, moe it and go random selection if, or flip a coin, however you want to do that. If, the group is kind of ambivalent to 2 options or 3 options, that is totally fine. And I actually have used that quite a bit with groups that, all of the opportunities on the board were equal, so to speak, or we just needed a starting point. So that can be effective. So before we actually, I probably don't have time to pause, but rhetorical question for you. Think about other types of decision making or other ways in which you have kind of process decisions, specifically in groups and collectively, whether that be, at your job with a coworker or in a coalition or whatever. I think that there's a lot of different techniques out there. Again, this goal was just to help you, be exposed to a couple more tools in your tool belt. And some of these are my favorites that I use quite often, especially with very dynamic, assertive groups. So what do we actually do with all this information? Where does it go? I actually am not going to be very prescriptive here. I think in previous years when I've talked about strategic planning with you guys, I've offered some specific templates. But the more I study strategic planning and the more I do strategic planning, the more options that exist out there that just make this very, very flexible. So a couple of things that I think are really, really critical. So everything that you guys have done in this preparation phase, in the pulling of like your current status, again, looking at the environment and the landscape, and then doing your brainstorming of solutions and ideas, and then even, down to like tallying things up and figuring out what the actual options are. There's a phase that all of this once it gets documented, and sometimes the documentation part is the super fun part because it gets really semantics and word specific and being really clear. Of course, the final product is typically a written document, and the idea is that anyone at any point in time can pick it up and understand where you're at or where your organization is heading. So, of course, in this document, I'm a firm believer or advocate that you have your mission, vision, and values on there, that folks understand who you are, where you're going, why you're doing what you're doing, and hopefully you have all of that predefined. If not, that's a totally separate conversation. But you can do that or weave it into some of your strategic planning work and efforts if you just started, or again, if it's never been done, or if it's been done 20 years ago and needs to be revisited. You can absolutely revisit that while strategic planning. Of course, you want to use SMART goals, which I think everyone is probably familiar with. There's a couple of iterations of what SMART stand for, but I go with specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time limited. Some people say achievable instead of attainable. Some people say time bound, time sensitive, timed, but they're all essentially saying the same thing. But from there, from a SMART goal, you want to tease it out into some more detail. And that's what these bullet points are really trying to describe. Is there's 1,000 ways you can do this. And it's up to you based off of what works for you. And I personally would advocate that keep it simple. Whatever is intuitive and makes sense, go for it. Because there's no sense making a headache for yourself. The plan is supposed to be able to be picked up and read by anyone, and that includes you. So make sure that it's in a format that you understand and can easily interpret. So you can see that some people, have a really complex hierarchy of goals, strategies, objectives, activities. There's always fun debates over what's a strategy versus what's an objective, what's a goal versus, what's a strategy. And that can be really complicated. Some people just do goals and activities. So what is the end game? Activities are kind of the action steps. Like what are the individual things we're going to do to achieve that goal? And then again, we talked about strategic plans being about allocating resources. And so even adding in a layer of the budget is an option. I don't see that very often, but I think at least from an internal perspective, that's an important consideration to have and recognize what that looks like. Some folks use more of like an outcomes matrix, so strategies, goals, action steps, or activities, and then the outcome measure. So how are we going to know that we've achieved our goals or strategies? Um, Input, process, outputs, outcomes is kind of like a process management or a quality management framework, and so that gets used sometimes. And again, the final one, goals, objectives, strategies, a benchmark. So where's our current performance versus what is our what is our starting performance is the benchmark versus where are we at now with the goal. The one thing or the three things that are highlighted in red are things I absolutely would advocate that no matter how you structure your strategic plan, you always, always, always include who's responsible for it, when is it due, and where are we at. Because that will translate your strategic plan into a project plan that you're able to look at every single meeting if you wanted to, and discuss progress and make sure that you're actually moving forward to achieve your goals. So no matter what structure you use, I 100% encourage you to please save yourself the trouble of asking where are we at? Did we ever do what we said in our strategic plan? What does our strategic plan even say? Who's in charge of that stuff? And include who is responsible, when is it due, and where are we at with it? Because again, you'll be able to pull it up then at every single meeting and say, hey, Veronica, this is due in a month. What's the current status? Where are we at? And help hold everyone accountable as well as be able to track stuff. So when your funders ask you, your regulators ask you, you'll always be able to have an answer. One final thing that I just put up here because I am fascinated by it and I wish that I knew how to draw is graphic facilitation. You typically would do this at the very end of strategic planning. So once you've had all those conversations, some facilitators or specialists that are really good at this, again, I don't know how to draw, so I can't do this, although I have studied it and tried to do it, is really helping tell your story. And so this then becomes kind of a visual that your group, whether it be a coalition, your organization, can get behind. You can hang it on the wall, you can print it out, hand it to people, put it on the website, whatever you want to do. But you can see in this particular organization, they use the tree model, which is really common. You talk about the roots being the root causes. What are the underlying factors contributing to kind of, in this case, I think we're talking about sexual violence prevention. So what are the underlying factors? And then what are the branches and the trunks of the tree are typically, they can be the programs that you're operating, they can be your interventions, they can be whatever it is that you're actually doing to address that work. And then the leaves and kind of the fruit of the tree are kind of your outcomes or the activities that you're doing. Like you can put outputs. There's lots of ways to interpret this, but I like graphic facilitation because I think it looks nice. And it creates a nice visual to help tell your story so that if and when you have people asking you what you're working on, you're able to be like, hey, have you seen this really fancy picture that we developed? This is our final slide on monitoring, and this goes back to some of the stuff that we've talked about already, or at least that I alluded to. So your strategic plan is a living document. It should be reviewed in every key decision-making meeting and updated to reflect that current progress. So again, where are we at with stuff? And use your strategic plan. Use it, use it, use it. If you're not making sufficient progress, don't change the goal, but figure out why you're not making progress. So is it there's not enough resources? Is the deadline not realistic? There could be a lot of things, but a lot of folks I've seen just jump to changing the goal, and that kind of impedes their success. If the goal has truly become irrelevant, so this almost is like the opposite of what I just said. But take the time to consider, is the goal completely irrelevant at this point due to the environment changing or whatever it is? Don't be afraid to update it, and you can absolutely do that as frequently as needed. I've been throwing around the construct or the timeline of like annually because that is an absolute bare minimum to me. But because this is a living document, I use my strategic plans in every single meeting. So if that is a monthly coalition meeting, a weekly coalition meeting, whatever it is, that plan is sitting on the table in people's hands and we're walking through it and talking about it, even if it's just for a minute, so that everyone knows where we're at. And so this last statement, plans should be reviewed and revised no less than semi-annually. That's in the assumption that you're not using it at every meeting or more often. So, I guess the big takeaway here is use your plan, use your plan, use your plan. So that is the conclusion of our session for today. In order to receive credit for it, I do need you to go to this link, and I just put it in the chat box for you to complete our survey, or training evaluation, excuse me. It does need to be done within the 48 hours. There you find my email address on this slide, as well as my cell phone number. So please, please, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or resources. I feel like I went a million miles a minute and that I didn't get a chance to be as interactive as I wanted to, but I hope that today was beneficial for you guys. And of course, we have upcoming trainings in the next couple of weeks. And so I look forward to seeing you guys or hearing from you all in the future.